All right, well, welcome to my channel. This is going to be the first video recorded episode I'm going to do for my YouTube channel. I decided I should have done this. I should have done this a year ago, but I've decided that I think this might be the easiest and most effective way to respond to various comments, tweets, either they're positive or negative. So I can either react and kind of oppose it, or argue against it, or clarify something. And hopefully these can be mainly short. So it'll be different than the blog post or the podcast, where I tend to be a little more long-winded, I suppose. But we'll see how this goes. This is my first one, so we'll see how far I get in this episode. What I want to do first, and oh yeah, I guess I'll probably touch up like the intro and put music and all that, but I haven't done that yet. So, but the first thing I want to talk about is going to be a series of podcast episodes through the podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary. And I don't know who the host of this is. I apologize, but he's interviewing Dr. Alan Strange, and who is a professor of church history at Mid-America Reformed Seminary. I'm not too actually familiar with this seminary, though I know it's Reformed, and they essentially affirm all the standard the Reformed confessions. So, well, Alan Strange is reacting to Christian nationalism and mainly my book. So he's treating my book as kind of the representative of Christian nationalism, which is itself something to talk about. But he goes through it. I think it's going to be 4 or 5 episodes. They're at episode 3, I believe, right now. And this week, they'll probably later this week, they'll come out with the 4th one. I'm going to cover the 2nd and 3rd one today, maybe only the 2nd one, depending on how long this takes. But I'll summarize the first one. So I'd say, first of all, I appreciate that they are addressing that, they are reviewing my book in a series of podcasts, it's quite the honor. I appreciate that tremendously. Even though it's negative like most other reviews, but still, at least they are talking about it, so that's good. So I won't cover the first episode that they did, because it was mainly kind of opening thoughts that I don't think you need to hear. And if you want to listen to it, it's about 15 minutes. You can see it on their website. It's called, so their podcast is called Roundtable, Mid-America Reformed Seminaries Roundtable. So you can listen to it as episode 190. This is 191. So in the first one, Dr. Strange, one thing to highlight is he said he's read my book word for word, sometimes several times in places, which was a good first sign. But then when you get to this episode, it's kind of like, okay, well, okay, I don't know how I don't know if you missed something or misunderstood, or I wasn't clear enough. So, but we will talk about that. And so that was one of the takeaways. He also mentioned several different books and writers. He mentioned Torba and Isker and their book, and other people who have written books on this topic, not positively or an affirmation of it, like Isker and Torba and I, but that was kind of the subject of the first one. Also, general kind of preliminary thoughts. So what I want to do is, I'll try, if I can get the software to work. I will get this up here. Okay, well, I can do this. There we go. All right. There's the episode website. I'll play a little bit of it, and then I will react to it. I want to start. Let me start the right part, because then they just do the music and all that sort of thing. So, all right, let's start right here.
Couple of more resources that our listeners could look at.
So some have criticized Stephen Wolfe. You mentioned his book, The Case for Christian Nationalism. Some have criticized him for not using the Bible. What do you think about that?
Yes. Well, the book talks about creation. It talks about the covenant of works as a part of this. It talks about political theology in general, and it really finds Christian nationalism to be the great end of all things. So I can appreciate why, in a sense, he does what he does. He says, I accept the Reformed understanding of many of these things, of the relationship of church and state. But what's interesting about that, let me just say this about that point.
Well, let me stop there. So I appreciate so far how he's responded to this, because he understands I think more than most critics on this point, he understands that what I was doing is I said, well, you have to start somewhere. I wanted a robust case for a certain Christian political theory, or and for Christian nationalism, and so I wanted a robust systematic theology to assume. And as I've explained elsewhere in my response to Brian Matson, maybe I'll link that below if I can. As I explained to him, I mean, I took the majority, if not almost the universal positions on with regard to theological anthropology. And so I did, yeah. And Dr. Strange, I think, recognizes that it's perfectly fine to assume certain aspects of the tradition. I think where he's gone wrong right off the bat is to say that I've assumed church state relations in my argument, as if I've just cited a bunch of authors when it comes to that question. So that the question of, say, like the original constitution of Adam, his original destination, the covenant of works, his reward for obeying God in his state of innocency. Yeah, I assume all that, and cite dozens of people in support of all those positions. But when it comes to actual church-state relations, or the role of the state with regard to religion, I actually do not assume that at all. So I'm kind of surprised he would say that, because in fact I offer I think eight or nine independent arguments for precisely that proposition, that civil government can promote and support and protect true, or the Christian religion. And so I don't actually assume that. The only thing I do assume with regard to that question, or the church state relations, would be the ecclesiology. So I assume some things about Reformed ecclesiology, again citing people like Junius and Keckerman and Alstead and others in support of that position. But that's really more of the matter of ecclesiology, and I don't think Dr. Strange or that seminary would disagree with it strongly, or I think they'd probably agree with it. So I think right off the bat, that's actually not the case. I think he's misread, kind of importantly, like seriously, my recognition of what I need to prove and not prove. Because as he's going to go on, he's going to say, well, historically things have changed. So let's just keep listening.
He actually plugs into, as he sees it, the Reformed understanding of politics, church and state, the role of the magistrate, from the period of the 16th through the 18th century. What's quite interesting about that is, even in that, it's my conviction, because, and to be fair to him, he's not a historian. He is a political theorist. So he does what political theorists or philosophers or that sort often do when they go to historical sources. That is to say, they decontextualize those sources and they recontextualize them in their own context. So he cites Calvin a lot, or Turretin a lot, others our readers would be familiar with, but he doesn't necessarily, he's not really looking in depth at what their context is and what exactly they meant and how we should understand them as things have developed. And he's not also attending to the point that since that time, since the 18th century.
I should say, I want to say that in there, with regard to like the folks that I do cite, it's on matters that don't really, I think, depend on context. I mean, at least you'd have to show me why the context of, say, the question of, was Adam's destination for obedience perpetual life on earth, or was it a higher eternal life? I'm just not entirely sure on that question, which I cite a lot of people for. That historical context matters. At least I'd have to. I mean, it'd be interesting if someone demonstrated that. But again, going back, I don't. I actually make the case. I don't assume, or based upon a bunch of sources, I make my own case for the thing he's saying I assume. But let's keep going.
Within the Reformed faith, he may recognize it, but he doesn't really deal with it, that within the Reformed and Presbyterian churches, there have been some changes about the view of what is the role of the civil magistrate vis-a-vis the enforcement of the law of God in both tables. there have been some changes in the American context. The Westminster Standards were modified at these points, and in the context of the Reformed churches, the three forms of unity, for example, there have been modifications even within the 20th century in the time of Abraham Kuyper about these matters and having to do with the relationship of church and state and how does this play out. So if you look at the three forms of unity and the Westminster Standards, the confessional churches, say the URC, RCUS, those churches on the three forms side, or on the Presbyterian side, the PCA, the OPC, those churches that abide by, seek to be confessional particularly, those churches have made and accepted these changes. And he doesn't really account for that. He doesn't really say why that was particularly or clearly wrong. He just goes back to certain figures and says, we've departed from that. We've departed from Puritan. Well, we haven't departed from Puritan on the vast majority of things, or Calvin on the vast majority of things, though we may have come to see this particular issue differently. I don't.
So, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't really have to deal with the development, mainly because I'm arguing in a way against the development, if that is actually, if you want to call it development. And so I don't really have to account for it. I mean, if I were strictly relying on tradition on those points, then yes, I'd have to. I think it'd be fair to have to account for it. But because I don't, then I don't have to. And so I also I don't say we've gone away. I don't recall ever in the book saying something to the effect of we've moved away from these guys in the past. I mean, I guess it's implied, but I don't know. But anyway, I mean, maybe he's kind of interpreting what I've implied, but
don't think historically he really accounts for that. And I think somebody like David Ennis, who writes on politics published by PNR, from a reform point of view, deals much more historically with what has developed and where we are right now. Wolf's whole book idealizes a certain view of church and state that, if it ever existed, hasn't existed for hundreds of years, and he's seeking to recapture. And this is my.
So first of all, David Ennis is great. So I'd recommend you read his book. I don't recall what it's called now, but he did write a very good book on political theology, political theory. He's a political theorist. So by that, I like David Ennis. Yeah, and I think the idea of an idealized state, I think this kind of goes to one of the confusions, when I actually provide throughout the book a lot of room for prudence. And so really what I'm providing is a framework through which we can do politics given the circumstances, the characteristics, the way of life of the people. So these principles are then flexible in application. And I think a lot of reform people in the last like maybe 50 years or so are not used to that kind of thinking, partly because they're reacting to either they've committed or kind of resigned themselves to kind of a procedural liberalism like we have today, or they think that anything that's going to go back before modern liberalism is going to be a sort of theonomic, rigid, absolutist type position. I get the sense that Doctor Strange is interpreting me in that way, but actually, I go through great pains throughout the book to try to say that this is a framework, this is a set of principles, and some things are permissible but not prudent, and so yeah, the idea of it. I mean, there is a place. I should say there is a place for talking about an idealized regime. So I mean, it's very just classical. It's standard in kind of the canon of politics to talk about the ideal or the perfect regime. So there is a sort of ideal perfect regime, maybe perhaps aristocracy, whatever, depending on who you read. But a lot of times the perfect is kind of the enemy of the good, or doesn't last, and it's better to have longevity with something that's good enough. So I would just say talking about the ideal is fine, even though I don't try to say we have to return. This is not like a return to 16th century Geneva sort of project. If anything, it's a return to a certain it's not even a return, but some kind of almost like almost 19th century kind of America church state relations. But anyway, that's for a different time.
Criticism, it ultimately goes in this direction, that the way he speaks about revolution and the right of revolution, and that we're under a tyranny, and it seems to imply, or it does say, that we should overthrow this tyranny. The only way we can get back to this, or get to a better place, sort of what Wilson is talking about in his Mere Christendom.
So on the violent revolution part, so yeah, I do have a chapter that justifies violent revolution. I mean, it's always weird when I hear Americans react so negatively to that. I mean, our nation arose out of a revolution, so I don't know why that there's such this negativity towards the idea of justifying revolution. I think I know what's going on is that they're afraid that I'm calling for revolution now. In that chapter, I do say that we are in a sort of totalitarian, like a liberal totalitarianism, and I was mainly trying to point to people that that the sort of power exerted is just this extreme level of soft power. And so I think we are in tyrannical conditions, even though there is not a sort of gun to our heads, or not being, not all of us anyway. Some people seem to be thrown in jail, but not, most of us don't have a kind of this threat of being thrown in jail. But there is a sort of psychological, moral type of tyranny, and I think it's going to get worse and probably actually be more visible than it is now. That being said, in the chapter, I do say very clearly that if you're going, that revolutions are typically failures. Even if you win the revolution, it ends in failure over time afterwards. It's often it's not a feasible option. It's not acceptable with regard to the results. And nowhere in the book do I say revolution now. I'm not calling for people to go in the streets or do stupid things. Nevertheless, and in fact, I've often said that if I had to cut something from the book, that would be one of the chapters I cut, because it's not essential to the overall Christian nationalism project. But the editors gave me room to put that chapter in there, and I'm glad I was able to make a case for revolution, which is a good American tradition, at least for one time it was. And but anyway, let's keep going.
It's hard to see how this is to be done without coercion.
Hmm.
And so all this is to say, though, you can't really argue all this without treating the Bible in any sense. He doesn't, for example, he talks about nations. He talks about that, not in a clear biblical sense, though, because the Bible, if you look at the Old Covenant, there's a certain view. The Greek word, of course, is that we typically translate nations, for example, in the Great Commission, is ta ethne, and we translate that nations. It really means people groups. It's the same word we get the word ethnic from, right? Ethnic identity. And so nations in the Old Testament sense, nations in the older sense, were discrete groups of people with a discrete language, with a discrete culture. And Wolf argues throughout his book that we somehow need to return to that. We need to recapture that. And he argues that it's unalloyedly good that nations developed in all of these particularities. But it's interesting that he doesn't even discuss Babel. How can you talk about nations? They were together, and their particularities, at least at Babel, they spoke the same language when they came there, and then God confuses the languages. So somehow the particularities are a judgment of God. They're not just an unalloyed good. And Pentecost, we all understand when we speak of it theologically as a sort of reverse Babel, so that you have, yes, you still have all the languages there, but the same message, the same gospel message is being preached there. And all the languages are hearing it in their own language.
So one of the things to note, so a lot of postmillennialists will say that, okay, at Pentecost there was a sort of reversal of Babel, and I've even heard that there were some postmillennial folks who believe that indeed there will be one language and one culture, and we'll all be kind of the same, scattered around all, on the earth. We'll reverse the curse from Babel. as I understand, Alan Strange is an amillennialist, and so in a way, he may not not affirm my premises, but he should come to the same conclusion, which is that if God then set up a certain set of arrangements, ethnic relations and ethnic diversity, and those are actually for our good, then they ought to be retained, that they are actually ought to be affirmed as a sort of way to deal with sin. So, I mean, this is kind of a lot of amillennial people just kind of accept the fact that in order to seek after the good, you have to contend with sin. So that's part of kind of the all millennial response to the fallen world. Whereas post millennials can often think, well, as the kingdom of God spreads, things will actually become better because of regeneration. More people will be Christian, and it's like it's built into the providential kind of trajectory. But anyway, yeah, everyone likes to bring up Babel. Interesting though that James Jordan actually agrees that in a sense the nations would ultimately prior to Babel they should have actually been created. That Babel itself, as this unified one group of people with the same language, was actually in violation of what God wanted. So I'm actually on James Jordan is on my side when it comes to that. My argument itself, I mean, it just seems to me, well, actually, first of all, you should notice one thing to notice from the Tower of Babel story is what they were able to achieve because they were all the same. So it's in a way, it actually affirms one part of my argument with regard to this kind of in group, this sense of like similarity within your in group and working amongst those similarities to achieve great things. So one of the obviously this was disordered, and they were trying to seek to essentially usurp God at the Tower of Babel, and to kind of in a sense defy God. Nevertheless, you can see that they were able to do something that was remarkable, though evil, but it was still remarkable because of their similarities, which suggests that if you're going to have a nation that can flourish well, that similarities, if properly ordered and good, actually would contribute and are necessary for the kind of a great nation. So that's one of my arguments that I have within the book. Also, the fact that it was after the flood, and it doesn't indicate the Tower of the Babel story does not indicate that had everyone spread across the earth, taken dominion, multiplied, that doesn't mean everyone would be the same. I mean, part of my argument is that, well, people would spread across the entire world. And if you were in, let's say, what we call China, and I'm here in, East Coast United States, we have no ability to communicate with one another. Our people groups are separated. And if this goes on for many, many years, many, many different generations, it just seems to me obvious that there would be differences that would arise. Differences in relation to your geography, in relation to the local food, in relation to cultural the sort of clothing you would wear if there's clothing. Um, I think dialects would change. I think we'd have to believe in something. We'd have to believe that in an unfallen state, that somehow there'd be from the very beginning a robust language that does not would ever change, and that really the kind of the let's say the change of Latin into French and Italian and Spanish was somehow the fault of sin rather than just people moving into different places speaking different languages. And this language is developed. I mean, I've heard of in different kind of pockets or hollers within the Appalachia and other places, just a few miles down the road, you'd have people who speak a little bit differently than the other people just down the road. And that's not because of sin, but it's because you have different groups of people who develop different terminology, accents, dialects, uh, given their relative isolation from others. So it just seems to me that that would be naturally occur, and that speaks to something about human nature itself, that we do kind of embrace these particular uh, that essentially that particular features, that things that are not kind of inbred, born into us purely by nature, that there are these things that kind of arise from our own belonging in the world with others that then we come to embody as a sort of second nature that we can't just shrug off. And it's things that develop over generations that your children then socialize them into. So that just seems to me, and again, was actually one thing that's been frustrating about the critique of that argument is that people don't really deal with that argument. They just call it speculation. But no one ever actually can. No one see. Everyone seems to think that everyone would be the same as they spread across the entire world. But what accounts for that? Like, why is it that my position is called speculative, but then you're going to say something such that this everyone's way of life is going to be exactly the same in every part of the world. No, the language is not going to change. Nothing's going to change. No one's going to be different at all as they spread across the world. I think that requires more argumentation. You can't just assume that to be the case, especially given Reformed theological anthropology. Which, I mean, if you read, I was thinking about writing an article on this. If you read someone like Herman Bavinck, he says very directly. He says one of the positive part, one of the good part of Reformed anthropology is that it does affirm that man has a sort of kind of natural, supernatural. He doesn't call it that, but has these kind of elements that direct him to higher things. But at the same time, is fundamentally a natural, earthbound being. So instead of positing this sort of this like super nature that is then kind of placed upon top of man and then somehow supernaturalizes the original state, there's a sort of middle ground that the Reform take between the naturalists and the supernaturalists. I think he makes that distinction, where in a way affirms both and say man is still an earthbound being. And I think that when you assume that anthropology, which I present in the book, then it does make sense to say that, okay, after the fall, there was significant changes in man, but the basic faculties, the basic principles of life, the basic necessities of life, all those things retain themselves as to their fundamental and their principles. Okay. So it then seems to me, if you're going to say people are going to spread across the world and be the same, like what faculty is doing that? Like what makes it so that what have we lost such that the distance between two people groups over a few hundred miles or 100 miles would radically change their language or their culture, their culinary tastes, or their dances, or their music. Like, what is that? Is it sin, or is it just simply because man is constituted in a certain way, and that's precisely what would happen? So this means then that I think, again, as I've said, man was spread across the world, or I should say that the consequence of Babel, that is the diversification, would have happened naturally. Okay, it would have actually happened. It would have happened naturally, even pre-fall. So, anyway, that was a long rant against that. He's probably still on that. So let's pick it back up.
So there's a lot of things that I think are deficient in that respect about Wolf's not using the scripture.
So let's look at some important terms for Christian nationalism that Wolf uses. It's going to be an interesting question. What does he mean when he uses the word nationalism? And dare I say, what does he mean when he uses the word Christian in this sense?
Well, he defines Christian nationalism in this way. He says Christian nationalism is a totality of national action consisting of civil laws and social customs conducted by a Christian nation as a Christian nation in order to procure for itself both earthly and heavenly good in Christ.
All right, so let me talk about the definition just because I can. It's kind of a little confusing to say a totality of national action. What I mean by that, people read totality and they think it means like totalitarianism. It's like it's really the dumbest move. It goes from totality, like a standard, pretty typical word within philosophy to talk about totalities, and just critical thought, and to say then, oh, it must mean totalitarianism. No, it just means totality just means that, like in this context, everything from like the minister preaching the gospel to you just being to you just loving your child, or I mentioned a mother's nursing of her child. So it just means that it's the full totality of action makes what a nation is. So what do you need? Well, you need military commanders who train you in the military, right? To be for a military force. Like a nation's military force needs those, but you also need strong families who are going to raise their sons properly to be tough guys, or you need schools to raise those boys to be strong as well, both in mind and body. And so there's a totality. There's different things that work together in a sort of unity. And so I'm saying it's a totality of national action, meaning that you put all that together, that is what will procure your good, your both earthly and your heavenly good. So, for example, like just think of like your heavenly good. In order for you to go to church and worship God without distraction, well, you don't want some guy or a bunch of a roving gang that might run in there at any point and shoot you up, right? You don't want a bunch of people starving from food. You don't want chaos and disorder in the streets. So even though, like, civil peace is not itself a heavenly good, it is part of the, totality of action or things that are required for you to have heavenly good. So that's the idea behind that kind of definition. He doesn't go into that. I just wanted to kind of explain that because it can be very confusing. I use the analogy of a soccer team. So like the forward or whatever, he scores the goal, so in a sense he wins, like the team wins because he scored a goal. And the defensive players, they very rarely score goals, but at the same time you need the defensive players to do their job in order for you to win. So you will ordinarily not win a soccer match if your defensive players are sitting down picking daisies, right? The other team is just going to score, keep scoring, even though they're not the ones directly scoring the points when they go up against the opposing team. So, in order for you to win a soccer team, the totality of action among the different players, both offense and defense, contribute to that, and in essential ways as well. So, the same thing with national action, everything from your job to your raising your kids to schools to all sorts of things, to government and law, and all those things contribute to that totality. So, anyway, that I hope that is an explanation. Some people have called that like Hegelian and of course totalitarianism, but it's really not as dark as someone wants to say it is. But all right.
And part of the problem with this definition is it seems like, and this is the thrust of the book, that the greatest desiderata, the greatest thing that we all ought to be aiming for, is not the regeneration of hearts and lives of individual persons, nor is it the reformation, as it were, of the church and the spread of the church and the spread of the church's message. He even says at a few points something to the effect of, unless and until all of this, what happens in people spiritually, what happens in the church as an institution, what happens in the institution of the family, the Christian church, unless and until all of this is properly externalized, not only in the state, but throughout a whole culture, you don't really have Christianity come into its own. You don't have Christianity purposed for what God purposed it for.
So I don't know where he's actually getting any of this. I have to be honest. It sounds like he's reading me as a postmillennialist, a certain type of postmillennialist. I don't know where he's getting this, because throughout the book I make a very clear point that the purpose of Christian nationalism is not, it's not an end in itself. I've said this on Twitter. I say it in the epilogue. I say it in other places. It's not an end in itself. The whole point is to create the best outward conditions that conduce to essentially the preaching administration, the preaching of the gospel and administration sacraments. So the whole point of this is actually to order the external outward things to what you might call the inward, or to use two kingdom language, is to order the temporal to the temporal kingdom to the eternal. So I don't know where he's getting this, and I think it's a serious distortion of my argument. Also that part near the end where what he just said, that nothing can happen unless uh, the state is Christian, culture is Christian. You can't have conversion of souls. It seems what he's implying. That I nowhere actually say anything like that. I do think, contrary to some post millennialists, I do think that spheres of authority, uh, you ought to, within your authority in those outward spheres, order things to Christ as best you can, um, and not wait upon some sort of grand revival. So if you're a Christian magistrate, and you can, if it's prudent. So I'm not saying you absolutely have to do everything, go to the max, but according to prudence, yeah, you should order the outward affairs as best you can, prudentially, to the good, to the spiritual good of the people. So I affirm that. And the same thing with culture and all that. But that doesn't rely on some grand like revival. It's just a matter of your obligation under that authority and for people's good. So, but at the same time, I'm not saying you can't have revival, you know, uh, w- without that. There can be, revival prior to all this happening. In fact, United States, it's a good bet that we're probably going to need some kind of revival. My concern with people like Doctor Strange and others is that, okay, if there is a revival, what are you going to do about it? This is something my friend always mentions. He's mentioned this many times. Okay, what if the gospel is successful? What if your preaching does create a revival in your state or in your country? What are you going to do now? Well, so that's like part of the point of my book was simply to say, if we're in that situation, then let's do it. But I like everyone who, like, I think most people who talk about waiting for a spiritual revival, when that spiritual revival comes, they won't actually have cultivated the will to do anything about it. So I don't think that's true for everyone, of course, but I think most people who talk about how you need ministers to preach a gospel before you can do anything in the world, I think that if the gospel were to be successful in some place, I don't think they would act upon it. In fact, I think they'd use it as a very reason not to do anything. So, oh, well, the spirit's at work, and that's all that we need. So that means So anyway, and I get the sense from actually Alan Strange that he's one of those people, and other people at Mid America Reform Seminary, that if the gospel is successful, they won't really know what to do about it with it, and wouldn't actually act upon it. So, but again, part of the point of the book was in fact to give principles of action, call for the training of the will to act when you actually have the opportunity. So,
Purpose and the thrust is in this world before the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, for there to be this rather full realization of Christianity manifesting itself in every aspect. And what I find interesting there is, of course, if we're to get from where we are right now, which is an increasingly secularized and increasingly hostile society to the faith, if we're to get to where he's talking about, it's hard to see how that's to be done apart from violence and revolution. And he says in the book that he will justify revolution. He will justify. Now, part of what he means is he will talk about resistance theory, which has always been a part of the reform discussion. But he says he will do this. But part of what I find interesting here, and dismaying, if I may say, is that earlier folks, and he wants to maybe tie this in a little bit, but earlier folks, say Christian Reconstructionists, who have talked about a desire for all society to be reconstructed along distinctly Christian lines, so that not only the state, but all of our culture, right? The art, the music, all of that has distinctly Christian Christian.
so now he's going to get into this kind of a long discussion where he basically, I think he said he met Rushdoony. He talks about Bonson, and apparently they both say that as he understands them, that the state should not do anything until there's essentially a revival. I'm not going to say that's what they said or didn't say. I'm not going to, I'll just assume they did. I think I don't think that actually is and I think Alan Strange would know this, that it's the reformers did not did not tell the Christian kings and princes, hey, you need to wait upon a massive revival within your city state, or your kingdom, for you to reform religion. They said, no, it's within your power. You ought to do it. So, in terms of historical practice, the idea of just civil magistrates sitting back and doing nothing, even if they have the power and the opportunity, and it's prudent, waiting upon some sort of grand, noticeable revival, that is completely foreign to the Reformed tradition, and that's a matter of tradition, of course. But then also just arguing for it positively, this is within their authority. This is within their power to do these things, and if it's prudent and it doesn't, undermine the entire state, then they can, again, when it's prudent, they can do this. They may do it. Uh, And in doing that, they are not coercing people to faith. So this is something that, of course, every detractor of mine will say, "Oh, that's not true." But if you read everyone from the early confessions to Calvin himself to, of course, Turretin, you can read the New England Puritans who, didn't like the Quakers and the Baptists. They say the same thing, that is that God is the Lord of the conscience. Everyone affirmed that. In fact, it was an argument against the Roman Catholics. It was something Protestants claimed for themselves, that they affirm the conscience, which meant that the gospel was principally, and faith and spiritual life was a matter of persuasion. Now, that being said, they affirmed at the same time that you still ought to regulate outward conditions to ensure that people are, as best authorities can, given the situation, to affirm that error is not propagated, that error is not perpetuated within society. Okay, and that's because error actually damages people. Error with regard to spiritual things harms people's souls, and so for that reason, it can be an outward object of suppression. Now, this doesn't force anyone to affirm anything. It just simply says you can't say your error. It's not you believe something and therefore I'm going to punish you. It's that you believe something that's actually that is harmful to another, potentially harmful to another, or it's disruptful of civil society, or Christian government, and therefore it's something you're going to suppress. And anyway, that was the argument, and they all the reformers, post-Reformation theologians, even someone like Althusius, who wasn't a theologian, but he was a jurist and a political theorist. They all affirmed that you can suppress outward error. I mean, this is even true up into the founding era and beyond, with something like blasphemy laws. I mean, people were kind of like heresy, suppressing heresy was kind of distasteful to most people in the founding era, but there still was blasphemy laws, and because they saw the denial of God and sort of sacrilege even towards the Christian faith was going to be detrimental to American society, and so it's actually going to harm the common good if you are a sort of public atheist or you blaspheme God or whatever. And so it was for that reason, for I think almost 150 years, if not more, after the founding, blasphemy laws were on the book. I think they're still technically on the book in some places. They just haven't been formally, um, overturned. But anyway, I guess what am I getting at, to go down to bottom line here? The bottom line is that I don't think that this begin with revival notion, even though it's not wrong in itself, I don't think it takes into account the nature of the authorities in public life and the sort of ordering and the effects of that order that can happen. And in saying that, I think that I'm consistent with the Reformed tradition and even our own American tradition, though not in the same application of the principle, but entirely. But nevertheless, same in principle that certain beliefs with regard to religion can have outward effects, either negatively or positively, and the civil authorities can, for that reason, seek to suppress that. Okay, and this is prior to any sort of like grand revival. And I say may again, I emphasize prudence, okay? Because I'm not saying every place, like if you live in Saudi Arabia and somehow you get power and you're not, and you're a Christian, that doesn't mean the first act you do is to say, okay, we're going to ban the Quran. I mean, that's so it has to be something that can actually lead to the positive good in its actually in its effect.
And texture to it, you might say. Somebody who, the father of Christian Reconstructionism is Rousseau Rushdoony. It would only be possible if the culture at large were a Christian culture, and the force of government could not be used to impose Christianity on a culture that did not want it. And so that's not what Christian nationalists are talking about now.
So that's actually not the case. So this is what prudence is all about. Prudence means that you cannot, generally speaking, laws that the people do not want are ignored or flouted and can actually lead to the subversion of government. This is something even way back into the early 1600s. Johannes Althusius in his work Politica says precisely this. He says that it's better to tolerate diverse religions than to let the entire commonwealth fall, because anarchy is worse than anarchy is going to be worse than essentially religious pluralism, is his argument. And so my argument is not that you get into power somehow and you force it upon people and then you destroy the actual commonwealth or the country. So that's not my argument. I do think it's possible, given certain conditions, where Christians as a minority could exercise rule over when even when the majority is non-Christian. So I think that's possible. And I mean, and just like you can tell America today, I mean, if you ask the average elite that whether or not men can get pregnant, I would say the average elite would probably say yes, at least if they publicly. You ask the average person in the country, and it would be no. So why do I bring up that? Well, the point being that you can have a minority who exercise rule, even when the majority does not agree with like these certain positions you have. And so that's just an example. I mean, there's all sorts of examples, even currently today, where you have a minority actually exercising more control over country despite being a minority. So that's possible. It doesn't have to happen. It's often not possible in any location, but anyway, the point being is that no, the point here is not to simply come to power and then impose upon an unwilling populace.
Now, they're talking about in a way of basically saying, we're tired of being pushed around. We're tired of being marginalized. We're going to strike back. And of course, we sing hymns like, not with swords loud clashing or roll of stirring drums, but deeds of love and mercy, the heavenly kingdom comes. And there's a sense in which they're saying, okay, that may be okay for the church, but this is how we want Christians to, conduct themselves in every other area to achieve this kind of really Christian culture and Christian society. This is our aim, and we're going to do everything in our power to bring it about.
Being pushed around. I that never really, I mean, never really crossed my mind that like we need to react because we're being pushed around. My uh criticism was for the Christian unwillingness, yeah, as you said earlier, to assert ourselves in the political realm. And I think we got overly comfortable in the Aaron Rand's neutral world, and now we're in the negative world, and no one knows what to do. You know, yeah, I do want to restore a Christian culture. I think Christians should be more assertive in that regard. We should stop being committed to neutrality. We should stop seeing public institutions, including schools, as being these religiously neutral institutions. And that if we're able, we want to have Christian schools. We want Christian government. Yeah, we do want that. Why is that? I don't know. When my kid walks out the door and goes and plays with the neighbor kid, I would like that neighbor and that neighborhood to generally understand what, even if they're not regenerate in their heart, they would be socialized into a way of life that follows Christian morality, right? I would like to live in a place where the sports organizations for kids would say, of course we're not going to have practice on Sundays. Of course we're not going to have games on Sundays. Of course we're not going to travel on Sundays. That's Sunday. That's when people go to church, right? You go to like a Muslim country, and they are not going to work on their holy days. Same thing with Jews. Christians are the ones in a Christian country. I was just talking about this the other day. It's like some lacrosse. This is the South. This is North Carolina. And there's a lacrosse team for kids that are like 13, 14 years old. And they have to practice on Sundays at 11 o'clock in the morning. Sunday. Oh, yeah, son, if you want to be part of this lacrosse team, you need to go to practice at 11 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. So yeah, I would prefer to live in a country or community or state or county or city or town in which that would be unheard of. That they would say, even if they're not a regular practicing Christian, they would know that that is just not allowed. And yeah, and the judgment on that begins in a way with the house of God, because of the fact that people are willing to actually leave their, or to not attend church to put their kid through a lacrosse practice on a Sunday. So yeah, that begins in the church. But I would prefer to live in that sort of community. Um, and I think what we have to realize is that, like, I think that people don't realize that those kinds of communities, they rely on a sort of confidence where people say, this is the way we are, this is our way of life, and that's it. So like you just take North Carolina, people here are at least culturally Christian, right? We could all say, no, we're not going to practice on Sunday. Are you crazy? We're not going to do that. They could all say no. They could say, that's, at the very least, that's not part of our culture. Sunday is the day we go to church. That's the day my grandfather went to church. We could all do that, but we're unwilling because we're so afraid. And I think that these people at Mid-America Reform Center, not all of them, but I think Alan Strange is one of them, that they are unwilling to assert themselves and affirm that good. And so in the end, what you get, you no longer is your kid going to play lacrosse in the community lacrosse team. Now you have to start some kind of Christian organization to do it, where now you're essentially you're a private organization outside of society. And for a lot of these things, there's a public institutions that have the money to do it. So you're probably not going to see a lacrosse, maybe, but like at the school my kids go to, they don't have a lacrosse team. They just don't have the money. They don't have much money to do anything except for basketball and cheap sports like soccer. No baseball team. So yeah, like if there is revival, can you actually keep it? Because you're unwilling to actually exert or assert the power necessary to maintain it. So, all right.
Let's look at some other terms that he uses. What does he mean by nation? What role does ethnicity play? And what does he mean when he says that grace restores nature? Let's look at those three real quick.
Yeah. Well, I think I've gotten at that a little bit. When he talks about nation, he never clearly defines nation. Interestingly, he defines Christian nationalism, and he defines what he's looking for. But
So I think with regard to the definition of nationalism or of nation, I think I define it clearly, but I think what I'm trying to define is something that the extension of the term doesn't have clear boundaries. It's like trying to define the word modesty. Like what is modest and immodest the boundary, the actual cutoff of that is harder to describe, even though you can define it well. But I'm not talking about nation in the sense of nation state. I'm talking about it as a sort of people group. So yeah, it's the edges of it, the extension of it's going to be kind of fuzzy. So I don't think it's a fair criticism to say that it's not clearly defined. But
He said, I could read to you. We don't have time to do that right now, but I could read to you what he says. And there's a shifting kind of definition. So nation means anywhere from a particular ethnic group that speaks the same language, has the same culture, to something more like, if you're talking about America, America has not been for some time that, and it's more of an empire than a nation. In other words, it's more it's a collection of people groups.
Yeah.
And but what's very disturbing is there are places and there are things not in the book. There are tweets he had.
so yeah, we can talk about this a little bit. Yeah. So my point, one purpose I had for that chapter on nation ethnicity, I used the word nation and ethnicity synonymously, which bothered a lot of people. But one of the reasons is I wanted to, especially for people in the West, to start thinking more about like the question of like who are my people, and along those lines, the importance of similarities, which I try. It's more nuanced than simply culture, but I somewhat encate in, uh, I essentially say that the ethnicity and culture are kind of the same. It's not entirely what I say, but it's close enough. And so, but I want people, and that's the reason why the method I took in that chapter was very much you need to reflect on your own people, your own connection to your place and people, and to try to get people thinking through that, because I think, especially in the West, that's entirely lost. And I think it's going to become even more increasingly important over time. So now he's going to talk about some infamous tweets.
Later where he talks about ethnicity and in a way that he says, well, we desire something rather pure.
Okay, I've never said that we desire something rather pure. I've never talked about ethnicity in a pure sense. And I wouldn't do that precisely because pure implies a sort of clear boundary between in and out. And I don't think you can talk about an ethnic group with those sorts of clear boundary lines. And so this is where I guess I differ from like white nationalists and others. I don't think you can have a sort of absolute distinction between in and out. It's such you can't really have a pure boundary line of ethnic groups. So that's I never say that. Right?
And he even has negative remarks. He makes negative remarks about marriage between persons of different ethnicities. And he does not.
So I don't have negative remarks with regard to anyone who is in an interethnic marriage. He's referring to a tweet in which I was talking with a friend and we were working through a sort of argument, and I was thinking out loud, and it came out, and of course people screenshot it and think it's confirmed all their sort of suspicions of me. So, and then I subsequently clarified and all that. I mean, I don't expect him to somehow he saw the tweet and so he's mentioning it. So I said very clearly that I'm not opposed to interethnic marriage. What I was working through was trying to think, how do you preserve an ethnic group? And again, by ethnic group in the book, it's essentially a sort of a common culture. How do you perpetuate and continue an ethnic group along those lines? It requires socialization of young people, which means you need, generally speaking, them to kind of marry amongst themselves so that they can socialize their kid within that way of life. It's like Greek grandmas hoping that their Greek son marries a nice Greek girl so that they can have Greek grandbabies, or Italian, or any other sort of ethnic group that would want to see the perpetuation of their way of life. And so that's what I was implying in that infamous tweet. I know people are going to use it against me for a long time, whatever, but that's what I was getting at. I don't think it's entirely unreasonable It was just the way I articulate it was actually not only unhelpful, but false in its articulation when I was just trying to get at something good, which would be the include would be the sort of passing down of a way of life and how that best happens to preserve a certain good of one's ethnicity. So I think that, well, let's see what we've got any more here.
Account for. He so revels in the particularities. He does not account for the gospel, particularly, things were broken up as part of the curse at Babel, and the gospel takes down the middle wall between Jew and Gentile. The gospel brings back together. And I'm not saying I would agree with him. That doesn't mean it does away with all cultures. We can talk more about that next time, perhaps.
All right. So what he does here is what a lot of people do, which is he'll say the gospel brings people like cultures together. It's a very pious sounding thing, but then they also think, well, wait, I mean, does that mean we have to eradicate different cultures? And then you think further and you're thinking, well, what about people of different languages? I think it's funny. I think it's like Neil Shinvey. He has this thing in one of his reviews. He says something to the effect of, well, I was at this Bible study and we were everyone, he's from there and they're from there. And he's, different people, different ethnicity group. And we're all just, one in Christ. Of course, they're all speaking English. I mean, they're all using English and so it's like, I mean, I get that there's something there, but you're relying on a particularity as essential as language for this sort of unity that you have, and you can just branch that out more and more, and you can read the book, the importance of particularity. But people then begin to realize that they start with like this principle. Oh wait, we've been made one in Christ. But then, like you think through it, and you're like, well, wait, this brings up all sorts of practical absurdities in life. So then they start like kind of walking back, and then they end up using this like vague language, which Dr. Strange does not. But he says like they say like, oh, it relativizes ethnicity or relativizes this and that, which doesn't actually answer the question. It says, okay, relative to what? Like, what do you mean relative? And it really becomes kind of this like wisdom statement rather than something you can use in logical analysis, where you just can now conclude anything you want, which means somehow always ends up being a sort of modern liberal multiculturalism. How convenient is that you relativize nations and ethnicity to affirm the current dominant social dogma with regard to multiculturalism. So yeah. All right. Well, that went for like an hour. So I'm not going to cover episode 2. I don't know if I'm too long-winded or what, but you can give me comments and questions or suggestions below, I suppose, ways to improve. So this is my first one. And I'll try to do the next episode next time. All right. So thank you for listening. And it's just going to go black, and that's going to be it once I hit the end recording button. So thank you. Bye-bye.